Welcome everyone to the first PLMA webinar of 2025. I'm really excited to reprise my role from the 2024 Load Management Dialogue with Peter. It was super fun to do it, lots of interesting content, and looking forward to audience questions. So speaking of questions, as we proceed with today's questions, please type any questions you have into the chat. We are reserving time for the end of the session to make sure that we answer a handful of questions towards the end. So feel free to put those into the chat function as we go along. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the veritable font of wisdom, Peter Kelly-Detwiler. Peter, perhaps you can say a couple words about your background and set the stage for discussing 2025 trends.
Sure, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here yet again. Much appreciated, and I enjoyed the conversation last year. I think we're going to have a good time here. So I've been in power markets now for 35 years. I got into competitive power markets in 1997 and rendered, in fact, the first invoice in the competitive retail industry back then. And then ultimately, I was at New Energy Ventures. We got bought by AES, then bought by Constellation. I was asked to start up and head the demand response group, and we built that pretty much from scratch. And then through acquisition of C-Power, we got that up to 1,700 megawatts of dispatchable load by 2012. And that's when Exelon bought us. I left, C-Power got spun out and became the huge demand response provider that it is today, among some others in the space. And now, since 2012, I've been writing and researching. I read 42 newsletters pretty much on a daily basis. If anybody wants that information, I have that newsletter list in a spreadsheet, and to just reach out to me on LinkedIn with your email address. I'll be happy to send it along. And so I do a lot of speaking. I'm doing a lot of research right now on data centers and impacts on the grid. I also follow electric vehicles and hydrogen and batteries and everything else that impacts the electrons. So it's a crazy, interesting, and very dynamic space to be in, as you are well aware, Olivia.
Yeah, absolutely. And, last session, 2024, you spoke a little bit about what I believe is on the next slide, which is raising the bridge and lowering the river. Do you think you could just do a quick, next slide, please. Thank you. A quick overview of what you mean by this, because I think this will be a thread that weaves through the rest of this conversation.
Sure. If we think about the need to meet demand, the raising the bridge part would be adding, as more demand comes into the grid, raising that bridge essentially to add more capacity. But what if we could lower the river? What if on the demand side, we could actually handle the situation and manage those sort of floods, those periods of highest demand that we otherwise have to build for? If we can do that, it's actually much more cost effective and quicker to design demand response programs to deal with those rather infrequent spate periods that happen on the grid, like heavy rainfall in a situation like this. It's much cheaper to do that than it is to actually raise the bridge. You can, for example, building a new power plant, given today's interconnection issues, is going to be a 3 to 5 year burden. In a best case scenario, demand response, you can do it. For example, the Ontario ISO enrolled or enlisted 90,000 homes within 6 months, 100,000 homes. Within 6 months, they get 90 megawatts of demand that they can manage during peak periods. That is not an anomaly. So that's what I mean when I say, well, we can raise the bridge, and we're going to have to raise the bridge because we need raw megawatt hours. But in terms of peak demand, lowering the river is a way more cost-effective strategy to address this issue.
Yeah, and I think I was chatting with somebody in our industry talking about trying to think about the value of DRs like yelling at the clouds. But I think, as we'll talk about today in 2025, there are some aspects to the environment in which we operate, whether it's regarding resiliency, reliability, and affordability, that sort of poise demand flexibility for this moment. So I thought we could structure today's conversation around was Peter correct in 2024? Let's test that crystal ball. We had a couple predictions. And then what do we think might be new for 2025? So I have 3 predictions and 3 key themes for our conversation today. So I thought we could move to the next slide, Rich, if you can, and go through prediction number 1. Our dialogue last year highlighted the need to triple the electricity supply by 2050 due to decarbonization efforts. Does your load growth prediction track? Are the load growth forecasts accurate, inaccurate, and in which direction? And of course, we have the elephant in the room, AI, entering as we speak. So would you want to speak to that, Peter?
Sure. So when we spoke last year, I love having my feet held to the fire about something I said a year ago. It's like Thanksgiving. You show up once a year and people are like, remember when you said X? So we last year talked about the drivers at that time being largely electrification of transportation, beneficial electrification, addition of more heat pumps. And yes, those things are still happening. And we also talked about the onshoring of industry, that sort of thing. A little bit less about data centers in the last year, since essentially once Chat GPT 3.0 and then 3.5 came onto the marketplace and sort of grabbed everybody and shook them and said, this is what AI can do, then you started to see a lot of investment in that space. And something which really surprised almost everybody was this massive rush to essentially to the market, to utilities and power markets to try and list supply for data centers. So that was pretty much unforeseen by myself, and it should also be said, ISOs and a lot of grid strategy experts. The only people who really saw that coming were in the data center industry, and I think even they underestimated last year where this is now headed. So got it partially right. I mean, EVs, they're still out there. You hear all the time about, oh, EV sales have slowed. Well, yes, they have, but there's still more EVs sold in 2024 than there were the year prior. We sold 1.6 million this year. There are now about 6.3 million on the road. So still an issue to take care of and address. Heat pumps still going willy-nilly in certain markets, but right now the bear that sort of entered into the room and has got everybody freaked out are those AI-driven data centers.
Now, I know everyone talks about this, and I guess I wanted to ask you, like, look at these ranges in the different sources, McKinsey and EPRI. What's the level of certainty around these bands? And what might be some blockers to what we're thinking about this sort of massive load growth moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm actually, I was on the plane last night from Florida and watched Olivia sleeping. I was researching what MISO is doing for interconnection and looking at large data centers, and also how PJM is planning it and what utilities are doing as well. Here's the issue. You have your traditional data center industry, which is still growing. The stuff we've been using to manage industry and store our cat videos for forever. But in the last couple of years, there's been a recognition that artificial intelligence can actually create a lot of potential gains for society, and they figured out how to solve some of the issues around training the models. So within the last few years, the large language models that use these huge chips, NVIDIA's chips, for example, and some of the ones from other competitors, used to be 300 watts, 300 watts, 400 watts. Now we're talking about 1.5 kW chips. These are parallel processing they're basic graphics processing units, sophisticated chips. So they came into the market, all these players come in, but here's what we don't know. Just like on the interconnection side, you have, if you're a developer and you want to spend, let's say $2 billion worth of capital, and you don't know whether you're going to have luck with this interconnection request or this one over here, maybe one in MISO, maybe one in PJM, et cetera. So you put multiple chips on the board, knowing full well you're only going to deploy $2 billion worth of capital, but you might put $10 billion worth of requests into the queue. And historically, only 20% or less of what's in our interconnection queues on the supply side has ever gotten built. The same thing is likely to be happening on the demand side. And in fact, Brian Janus, who used to head up supply for data centers for Microsoft and now is the CEO of Cloverleaf, which manages data center build-outs, he thinks that there are a lot of zombie applications out there, that simply once they finally get an interconnection request at utility accepted, they'll pull the chips off the board. They might even loan land that they could put it on, but there's so much money at stake right now, it's astonishing. You might have heard SoftBank and a few folks the other day at the White House talking about an investment of $500 billion. That's $500 billion by my numbers. Wow. Or Microsoft talking about $80 billion next year in AI investments, $40 billion of which will be in this country. Now, one last thing to think about, or 2 points, Olivia. There are multiple players chasing the game of AI supremacy. Just as to use an analogy, there were multiple players chasing search engine supremacy during the dot-com boom. And at the end of the day, only one or two survived. And if you don't believe me, you can go ask Jeeves or look it up on Mozilla, right? My point being, Google won, everybody else lost. In this particular instance, you've got OpenAI, you've got Meta, you've got Google, you've got Microsoft, you've got Databricks, and so on, and they're all chasing the holy grail of becoming the dominant LLMs. Quite likely, a few of them will die on the side of the road on the way there, because this is not for the faint of heart. You have to be super heavily capitalized, and you've got to have really good data scientists working for you. So one of the big risks is that a lot of these won't come to fruition, and then a risk, maybe you build them out and someone's there for 3 or 4 years, and then they just can't hang with all their competitors. So now you have stranded assets. And then the other piece that can't be ignored right now is what happened with data centers on the last go around over the last, say, decade, which is that the PUEs, the user effectiveness of the CPUs and the data centers got more and more efficient over time. So even though data center load grew tremendously, energy consumption only grew by a little bit. It was almost flat. And so right now we're predicting these screaming increases in load, but you also have the possibility that the chips could get way more efficient because they're starting to engineer these chips not for games anymore, but specifically for LLM. And you have somewhere around 40+% of data center load today, energy consumption, is for cooling, because the chips generate an enormous amount of heat when they're crunching through all the data. There are new technologies out there whereby you can immerse the chip in a dielectric fluid and essentially pull the heat away way more efficiently with liquid cooling, which could reduce the cooling burden by up to 90%. So these forecasts are predicated on known technology today and anticipated demands in a world that's really only just gotten started, with tech that's evolving really, really quickly, uncertain markets, and all these players, none of whom have demonstrated a path to profitability. Just like with the early days in the search engines, nobody knew how they were going to make their money. They just knew they better win, and then they'd find a way.
And figure out a way to do it. Wow. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So I guess somewhere we'll see what happens. Some ranges of uncertainty, but clearly a lot of demand for electrons.
Big is big. Big is big, and it's going to be in certain areas and not in others. Like Dominion right now, 25% of their load in Virginia is data centers. AEP in Ohio with their 765 kV lines, they're going to see a ton of data centers being built there just because they have the transmission. So there'll be pockets of the country where electricity is available and communications cables are available that will be some of the hotspots for a lot of build out, and other places it'll be fairly quiescent.
Right. Yeah. So it'll be spotty regionally in terms of how we see this, but no question there's going to be load growth won't be flat.
Correct.
We'll make that prediction for 2026. Let's move to prediction number 2, that load flexibility will be a critical element in meeting the challenge of raising the bridge and lowering the water. Are there any interesting use cases that demonstrate the critical load role that load flexibility has played in 2024 to meet these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, you see, I already alluded to the one that IESO did. Then you've got, for example, one of the member companies reported this year that they had moved, well, they have millions of connected devices now, and they shifted a gigawatt hour during various events 3 times this season. And you've got like Portland General Electric. Today, they manage 2% of their peak demand with DR, or they can cut 2% of their peak demand, an equivalent. They're planning on cutting 25% of their peak capacity with DER programs by 2030. And you've got like APS, 97,000 thermostats, 160 megawatts that they can essentially reduce consumption. The cool thing about DERs is, and / virtual power plants, you've got different communities of end-use devices. So you got your passive solar on the rooftop that you can tie to batteries. And batteries are awesome. Why? Because they're specifically designed to interact with grids. All they do for a living is absorb and release power and lose maybe 10% on the round trip. Then you've got your electric vehicles, which are supersized batteries on wheels, which are only just starting to harness. You have some managed charging programs, and your initial V2G programs like that Zoom One, ZUM, that was announced with the Oakland School District, where they're going to deliver 1.2 gigawatt hours of energy from 74 school buses, I think it is, to PG&E every year. So that's one reason PG&E let them interconnect faster. So you start now to see vehicle to grid in those buses, a little battery in people's garages, 10 kWh, 12. These buses are 150 kWh batteries each. So they're monsters compared to, and your electric vehicles could be 50, 100 kWh. So we're starting to see managed charging, Baltimore Gas and Electric, pretty cool program. Other folks looking at vehicle to grid. It's early days still, but we see the green shoots. And then you also see the announcements, Rocky Mountain Power, Green Mountain Power. They're putting batteries willy-nilly behind the meter, both for resilience and for that virtual power plant thing. And then you see, companies like, Renew Home with energy, and Google with a gigawatt target of thermostats. So you got your solar and your batteries and your EVs, which are all meant to move enormous amounts of power and specifically interact with the grid. And then you have these other devices that are meant to do their other thing. The thermostat doesn't wake up in the morning and say, how can I interact with the grid the way the battery does? But
do some arbitrage in the morning. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the water heater, same thing. They are meant to do something else, but they have this inherent flexibility and sort of storage capability, whether it's thermal storage of a building in the built space or thermal storage in a water container, right? That allows you to flex and shift and move things and do it way cheaper. And now with all this pressure on the grid with data centers, which are not that flexible, there's going to be higher avoided costs and more value for these DERs. And I think we're going to see acceleration of that space as a consequence because the value is
greater. Certainly the timeline around building these out is shorter and the need for it is even greater than when we talked in 2024. You mentioned a couple use cases several of our members are doing, and really sort of aggressive megawatt goals, but also enrollment of customers. When we were talking before this dialogue, we were talking a little bit about like the Swiss Army knife. And a DER has, all sorts of things, and the corkscrew and the, all the different tools that are needed. And we talked a little bit about, continuous orchestration and multiple events, and how we're actually starting to see, movement from DR 1.0 to DR 2.0 to DR 3.0, to use a PLMA terminology. So this is a pretty nice segue to our third prediction, which was virtual power plants. In our prior webinar, you discussed the transformation of single DERs, like predominantly battery VPPs, into integrated DERs as a way to maximize revenues, streamline customer engagement, because many of these customers might have multiple DERs within their homes, but also can offer load at different times. So we're also, seeing, we recently saw the update that came out, the VPP 2025 DOE liftoff with a number of new use cases. And it seems like it has, quote unquote, lifted off. I guess I'm sort of wondering, now that there are multiple DERs, we're aggregating DERs together, we're thinking about more continuous orchestration. How do you see the world evolving in terms of communications, technologies, and integration related to either AI innovations or standards protocols like Open ADR 3.0 or Matter or Mercury? How do these all kind of fit together to enable VPP liftoff?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different communications protocols right now. And I remember at Constellation, we're like, oh, we have our own, we don't want to do Open ADR. There was a little bit of not invented here, but there were also some reasons for it as well. But it's kind of cool, like Open ADR 3.0. I actually went in because I was curious about it, and I looked at the code. Well, I look at code, and it's not like I really know what I'm looking at, but I looked at the old code versus the new code, and what you can see is there are way fewer lines for streaming these prices, if you will, from 3.0 to devices. So there's certainly a lot of progress being made in that space. And if you think about the ability of AI to harness all of these resources, I think we're standing at the precipice of faster and more ubiquitous situational awareness and the ability to communicate with all types of devices and pull them all back. Now, there's still challenges. For example, with EVs, are you talking to the charger? Are you talking to the car? There's a lot of challenges there around is it telematics with the car, or so on and so forth. So there's still a lot of pieces that need to be worked out and standardized. And in DER, that liftoff report, there was still a discussion there around the need to standardize some kind of a registry, which hasn't, and I'm involved on a collaborative utility solutions board, the DOE, liked what we were doing, but it hasn't gotten the traction that we hoped that would have, which would, all of this ultimately, as it mentions in that liftoff report, you need to expand the DER adoption. You have to simplify the enrollment. You have to find ways to integrate into utilities and into bulk power systems, and simplifying and standardizing the communications around that is a critical piece of how to make that happen. We're not there yet. And because each group comes into it with their own protocols, you do end up with this risk of sort of a not invented here Tower of Babel approach, which does defy the, one would hope, standardization and easier and bigger implementation as we go forward in time. Some of
Yeah,
that
certainly to unlock scale, right? And
Yeah,
if we
exactly.
think the adoption forecast scenarios for DERs, will create this demand, how can we do that in terms of that? So actually that leads us to our 2025 key trends. And I think you did a little bit of foreshadowing already. We talked a lot about AI related to load growth. And you mentioned AI in terms of load flexibility, but I thought we could dig a little bit in terms of how AI can be used to help optimize load flexibility and, dare I say, enhance customer enrollment or engagement. So we highlighted the importance of AI in managing VPPs in our last webinar and the need for situational awareness in the distribution system. How do you think AI can advance load flexibility and unlock scale?
Okay, so the first thing, if you think about AI in its full-blown state, you would then imagine a world in which you have instantaneous and correct information that's marshaled in ways where the data turns into useful information. So let's posit a use case. I'm utility X and I have 50,000 transformers in my service territory, and I know where all my batteries are and where my EVs are and my thermostats are, etc. And I know which of these transformers are going to be thermally stressed tomorrow because it's going to be 95 degrees and 90% humidity, and my grid's going to peak at 6:15 p.m. to like 8 o'clock at night, and here's where my trouble is going to be. Now, if I don't do something within the next year or two, I'm going to run into a lot of cases where those particular transformers are going to be stressed at those times, right? So now I have a situation where I could say, oh, in those neighborhoods with these transformers, I know where they are, I know how they're going to be stressed, and I know I have the ability to de-stress them by managing my charging or doing V2G or changing my water heaters or something. And I also know what it's going to cost me to replace those devices or upgrade my feeders or do the other things I have to do. So now I have a situation where I could define an avoided cost, which could be zero for 8,700 hours in the year, in that 8,760 hours of the year, and it could be $1 a kilowatt hour for another 20 hours of the year, and then for the last 40 hours, it could be $10 a megawatt hour, a kilowatt hour, excuse me, because I'm going to have to replace this thing. So you could, with AI, create a landscape, if you will, for every single device on your grid, and know what the avoided costs are at any given time of the day based upon how you model that. And then you could look at the devices that are located behind those assets that are going to stress those assets and say, okay, I could now know, here's my avoided cost. Now I have essentially a budget. I know how much I can spend to defer the investment and make new investments in this area. Just the same way Con Ed did with the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Project years ago and avoided the $1.2 billion in substation feeder investment there and spent like 116.5 million and pushed the need out for an estimated 10 years. So you could take that BQDM thing and put it everywhere and come up with a super granular pricing environment that's temporally based. That's what AI could do. And any human trying to do that would just want to go away and walk into the cold water and never come home in the middle of the Lake Ontario or something. I mean, it'd be a horrendous thing to ask people to do, but ask a machine to do it, a complex series of machines, that's doable. Then you'd have to, figure out, okay, how do we enlist devices? How do we do it all? But that's the holy grail is you now could have this whole series of avoided costs, and you could map on your bulk power system avoided costs for those hours as well, right? Now, you could create something where you take a grid that's super inefficient, runs at 41%, 42% capacity / load factor, and charge your batteries when you have a whole bunch and cars, and your water heaters when you have surplus solar, and then release that energy into the grid or not consume it during other periods. And maybe you could make your grid 50% efficient. And that's all economic goodness that could pay for the cost of those investments.
Right, and make sure that there's a affordability aspect to that. So this is fascinating
Absolutely.
stuff, Peter. Question for you, right? Like the allure of AI and a machine sort of creating a free market, if you will, with no information asymmetries, and knowing actually what the value is for things in the moment, right? Is great.
Yeah.
Two barriers I want to address. One, those pesky regulators.
Yeah.
How does that work? And people, right? How do you get people to engage, right? So I think that to date, we've been talking a little bit about value streams, right? Wholesale, retail, infrastructure deferral, what's going on in terms of there's increasing volatility in capacity market prices, PGM with all what's going on with PGM last year, for 222s coming up. So there's more aspects and ways to develop market pricing, at least at the wholesale level, that's clearer, and AI can certainly help to inform where that is at a distribution level too, with all of that data. I guess my question then becomes is, yes, we can understand the avoided costs, and there's new value opportunities to freeing up that capacity. But what types of regulatory innovations need to occur or have occurred to be able to unlock this value? So actually measuring the value is great. Like I'm an evaluator. I love measuring it.
Yeah.
But then how do you actually get it, or get customers, stakeholders, vendors, or utilities to capitalize on that value?
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing, what I find fascinating about this is I worked for several years in Mogadishu, Somalia, and Accra, Ghana, and different places. My background is as a development economist, and I was involved with tech transfer back in the 80s. Could we bring new technologies to Africa? Could even be like a borehole water pump type thing. And what we found was you can't just assume somebody wants a new technology because it can disrupt the way they do things. So for example, there were these pumps put in and women didn't have to head load water half a mile from the river. And the men stole the gaskets in the water pumps to brew beer with, which I would have probably done. And then the development economists came back and said, hey, they stole these, we'll put new gaskets in, everybody's good again. Well, they went away, the gaskets were gone. So finally they said to the women, why aren't you stopping the men from doing this? You got to head load the water from the river. And the women said, you never asked us whether we wanted not to carry water from the river. That's the time when we get to chat with each other. We get away from our families. We socialize. It's part of the fabric of our community. And you've come in and disrupted it. And what that taught me was that technology transfer is a sociological issue. And in fact, economics is an expression of what we value, right? And so one of the first things you have to do is figure out whether what you're trying to do is going to disrupt or in some ways cause anxiety with people. So what one can do here is, first of all, you paint the value prop to the regulators. Then you can do some pilots. Like, for example, in California, PG&E is now streaming hourly prices. They started in December to some markets, and CalFlex has a program, and so they're testing this out. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think what you want to do is offer this as a service. So you say to someone, I will guarantee you, your availability of your electric vehicle or your water when you want it, that sort of thing. I'm going to take that out of your hands. If it doesn't work, I will pay you a penalty. And let me just handle all that. And I'll basically do all the IT work, the AI work. You don't have to think about it. You don't want to be that individual saying, it's 9 o'clock in the evening, I wonder what the price of power is. Who wants to care about that? But if someone said to you, I'm going to enroll your water heater and you're never going to be inconvenienced, and I'm going to pay you $10 a month to do it. Or, we've already seen pilot programs in Europe with Kaluza where hundreds of EVs balance the grid with grid balancing services, and they get paid pretty good sum of money to do it. And they have an app and it guarantees them that they'll always have a vehicle charged when they need it. They can basically say, here's my no-fly zone. You can't mess with my vehicle during these hours. And so, there are ways to use technology to overcome these issues and not inconvenience people. Although we do have to be aware of, for example, there was a pilot a couple of years ago in the Pacific Northwest with water heaters, and a small number of folks had cold showers. And boy, the people who are inconvenienced are loud, and they should be. So you got to be very wary of potential for failure, because that's where you can get into problems. You have to be really thoughtful about what can go wrong and try and insulate against that. But I think those are some of the ways you solve that problem. Recognize it's a sociological and behavioral issue, and then try and take people out of that decision-making equation where you can. Make it convenient for them.
Right. Yeah. And I think actually that's one of the things that excites me a lot about AI is how it can enable and unlock dynamic pricing, so
Yes.
that the signals are sort of more accurate for everybody, but you're still in a sort of, what does Mark Martinez say, set it, forget it, automated environment, that, people don't have to be inconvenienced by. And of course, each DER is used for different reasons. So you have to be, tailored to each of those DERs to a certain degree. I wanted to ask, you talked a little bit about avoided costs. And, I think one of the things I hear throughout the industry is sort of, there's a lot of value at the distribution level, but it's very challenging to sort of quantify what that is. What is your take in terms of what needs to happen to be able to quantify either distribution grid impacts and turn that into value for load flex, or other types of avoided costs that we should be thinking about, whether it's, but as I mentioned, distributional or locational, or reliability, resiliency, affordability. Are there any interesting use cases for these types of value streams that you're seeing, in terms of sort of quantifying that value, or thinking about how to engage with that value as we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, so one other one, is carbon too, right? I mean, like Google
Right,
thinks
exactly.
about when they run their compute function based upon the carbon intensity of the grid. I mean, there have certainly been some interesting use cases, or I should say studies and things coming out of California, for example, where California has their prices to devices concept, where they essentially have a whole stack of avoided costs for every hour, every 15 minutes of the day, and then they stream those to the customer. So there's the distribution avoided cost, which can be really temporally and locationally specific, like we talked about. And then there's, bulk power system costs. And then there could be, some cost of carbon associated, et cetera, et cetera. So in theory, we know how to do it. The real challenge is, well, how do you define what that value is, especially things like carbon, where there's not a sort of formal market in many cases for it. So who's willing to pay for that? And even now with the utilities, we know what avoided costs are. That study that was done, Kivala did for the CAPUC with respect to full electrification of transportation, said if we don't manage charging, costs could be up to $50 billion, for the upgrades we need. Well, they assign costs, everywhere based upon certain assumptions. So we know it can be done. The question is, how do we start this off at some granular level and try it and see how well it works and what the real costs of implementation are, and then how do we replicate? And we also need to take social justice issues and equity issues into account. They don't go away irrespective of who's in the White House.
Yeah, and actually that's a really nice segue to the sort of third key trend that I was hoping we could talk a little bit about. LB&L just put out a new study for their retail electricity price and cost trends for 2024 update. And it summarizes sort of that retail electricity price levels and price drivers in the United States across the country. And it shows that utility costs and retail prices have gone way up, despite retail sales staying fairly flat or even declining. And that fuel and purchase power and transmission and distribution costs have risen significantly, which has put upward pressure on rates. So this, suggests some implications for the value of locational demand response, demand flexibility to help support affordability. But, there's how load flexibility can support reducing rates, but there's also the optics of investment in specific customers for costly DERs. And so, as adoption and electrification increases, I live in California, and in our legislature is considering canceling the PPP, which is basically the charge on your bill that funds energy efficiency, demand response, low income programs. due to rising rates and sort of the optics and how angry people are with 1 in 3 customers at risk of being on arrearages. So I'm wondering, can you speak to how load flexibility or dynamic rates can help support and promote affordability, and what role can we do as an industry to mitigate these affordability challenges?
Yeah, so first of all, part of what we're paying for right now is replacement of old equipment or having to upgrade equipment because of new demand on the system. So it gets back to how efficiently can we use the grid. I mean, one of the things that's beautiful about demand response is the fact that the grid is so ugly from an efficiency perspective. When I look at 42% capacity / load factor, I see huge economic opportunity that could lower rates and pay for a lot of things if we could address it cost effectively, right? Waste is a resource in that sense. You can mine it. And so that's, I think, step one is to prioritize where are those highest avoided costs and go after those and figure out, well, I mean, every utility has its ratepayer impact test and so on and so forth. So you can run those through a series of scenarios or filters and figure out which ones make the most sense. And, Taco DeVries had made a comment while we were discussing, one of the things you got to make sure you also do is make sure you have overlap and there's sufficient reserve margin, if you will. If you need to get 10 kW from this place behind the meter, make sure you're going after 11 or 12 in case some resources aren't available, right? Don't set yourself up for failure there. But I think if you look at this thing and say, well, what's driving those costs and pinpoint what it is? Yes, there's wildfire issues, public safety power shutoffs and wildfire and so on. Okay, that's going to argue for a lot of potential microgrids because you're going to be doing more and more grid shutoffs, but you have areas that critically need electricity, hospitals, other areas, police, fire, and so on. Okay, so if you're going to put microgrids in, make them capable of creating efficiencies on the grid. No, don't just throw them in without thinking about holistically how they fit into the larger thing and how you can either reduce costs within that microgrid over the whole system. This begs for a systems of systems thinking approach. And part of the problem is we keep on band-aiding. And that's something we have to get away from. And most of the pilot projects you see and most of the applications today are still band-aiding. They're getting bulk power value or they're getting distributed power value, but they're not seeing all the pieces together. And we live in a world that is integrated, but we treat it as if it is disintegrated. And we have to start thinking differently about that. That's where we're going to get value and avoid paying the cost that we continue to pay.
Instead of silos, we want more value stacking, right?
Absolutely. And it's not, it actually translates into the organization of the utility itself. Because what you have to do is, first of all, think about this, recognize every utility is essentially a cyber physical entity, right? They always have been because they've always had a SCADA system and so on, but now it's SCADA married to IT. So the very first thing you have to think about is, well, what fundamental investments do we need to make in the underlying IT platform so that as the world evolves, we can continue to build on that platform and we don't have to rip and replace. That's hard, but it can be done. And then you think about, okay, more and more data is going to come in. Who are we going to hire? We got to make utilities, for want of a better word, sexy to data scientists and people who love grokking on data because it's one of the biggest data plays in the world, or it could be. And so you've got to actually change your workforce and think about that. In fact, I did a keynote this morning at a retail energy provider, and they were so excited because they've hired a whole bunch of young people, 25 years old, and they said, these people think about data and analytics in ways none of the rest of us do, and they're educating us and changing the way we think about how we serve our clients. This is the revolution that's necessary in utilities. And as we build those new fundamental underlying platforms, make sure that the previously siloed data now starts to get integrated. We know where the data of record is, but we understand who needs to see it, when they need to see it, at what level they need to see it, and who can change it as well. And that, again, requires a fundamental reinterpretation of who we are as utilities. It's not easy. I've been in change management in large organizations, and what's the first reaction of everybody there is fear. Will I have a job tomorrow? Will I be as well compensated and respected? And so it's not easy, but does it need to be done? Absolutely, given all of the challenges we face. It's time for us to recognize we really do need a utility for the 21st century now that we're 24 years plus in.
Yeah, and I think doing that in an environment where we know that there's so much growth that's going to happen, hopefully it's more a collaborative environment as opposed to thinking about more like a mercantilistic system. There's a flat amount and you're like have to divvy it all up to each person, right? With data center load growth and everything, there's so many challenges to be solved. There's room for everybody to contribute in different ways in terms of the solutions. I wanted to sort of close our dialogue thinking a little bit about the customer, Peter. And I wanted to think a little bit about like access and equity. We talk a lot about, the certain more conceptual challenges, right? Or physical challenges, the grid, or conceptual around value and how do we quantify it and how do we enable it. But when it comes down to it, how can we work to support a more equitable access to DERs? And what does that look like in terms of the programs or resources that we develop? Because ultimately, customers should be adopting those DERs to enable that load flexibility. And what approaches should we be taking to enable that?
Yeah, so the very first way you get extra capacity on your system is not even targeted DERs, it's efficiency, right? It's weatherization programs, it's more efficient lighting, it's all those things that typically, low-income people pay a larger percentage of their salaries to energy than the rest of us. That's just a given fact. They have much less discretionary income, and many of them are energy poor, and you mentioned how many are in arrearages. Well, if you want to reduce some of the risk to the utility of arrearages, what better way to do that than invest in efficiency? Because it does a couple things. First of all, it reduces their overall bill. It gives them more illumination or other services for the same dollar. The second thing, you now have trained up a workforce that, by the way, you can pinpoint and move very, very quickly, unlike building a power plant where you have a big bulge and then the project's done and then they go away. This, you actually, and studies have shown this for decades, you actually can create a local workforce. It's not super high skilled, it's repeatable, and it's targetable. Then the next thing to understand is that a dollar saved in the local economy creates more jobs than anything else that you can do. The multiplier effect is super huge. So the very first thing when you're talking about LMI is efficiency. Then the next thing you say is, okay, where else are they incurring their costs? And how can we enlist them? And now, a challenge a lot of times is they live in multifamily housing. So now you have to think about, all right, what's the conversation there with a water heater, or are there batteries that can be put in? And yes, there are certain programs, there are people who are expert in dealing with this, but you have to make a conscious effort. If you want to do this, it's not as easy as just saying, oh, let's send out the market signals and then people will respond in an elastic fashion. No, there has to be a deliberate approach to dealing with this issue and understanding what your pilots are, and then get out of the pilot phase. Once you learn that, then try and fly that thing. We pilot ourselves to death. Those little airplanes wrecked all over the airport. Let's get some of these things off the ground. I think we need to do better in designing pilots to think about, well, what's the replicability that comes out the other side? Once we get the learnings, what are we going to do with them? We don't do that well enough.
I used to teach a course on how to do pilot designs such that you can have generalizability of your results to other populations. So you're music to my ears.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, it's common sense. It's not easy, though.
Yeah. So actually, we've hit our 10:15 mark, which means we are moving to the next phase of our dialogue. Thank you so much, Peter, for those insights around whether or not your predictions were right. And I think we found that, yes, they were, if not even more aggressive in the case of load growth. And in terms of the key trends that we covered, hopefully that covers a lot of the folks that PLMA represents. I think it certainly does in terms of load management practitioners. So I wanted to kick us off with a question around the role that dynamic electricity pricing will have for load management technologies. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so one more, before I answer that, I do want to, someone said Ross Melmy had astutely raised a question, what about community solar?
Oh,
And
yeah.
in terms of addressing LMI, community solar is awesome. And I actually know, even though I'm not LMI, because I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, I bought the output of 5 panels for $5,700, and it shows up on my bill each month. And then I got another 20 panels in another direction, where if I pay $100 a month for their production, I get $115 credit on my bill. And so a lot of community solar programs have subscription capabilities where customers can sign up and be subscribers, and they get a credit on their bill with no capital outlay. And so that is a really good way to do it. And a lot of states specifically target LMI communities as at least a portion of the community solar off-takers. So that's something I forgot to mention. Thank you, Ross. Okay, so now to the question around, what were you talking about, dynamic pricing and technologies?
How can what role will dynamic electricity pricing have for load management technologies?
Okay, so it's going to depend on the tech, but a lot of them would be elastic, that is responsive to price, if we could make them so. So the dream of prices to devices has been around for a long time, because if you think about it, right now, and this is with all due respect to all the intermediaries, because they're all breaking ground the same we did at Constellation, there are these programs that are still somewhat artificial in that they're structured for X number of hours a day. If you participate, or when you get a notification, you respond. That'd be like, oh, if I get a notification tomorrow, I'm going to go and eat 2 pounds of French toast. Like, it's a random thing. Versus if I go to the store and the price of bread went, there's a special and there's a buck a loaf instead of $2.50, I'd go buy 2 loaves and some eggs and make a whole ton of French toast. But it'd be a market-driven response instead of like these sort of artificial signals. That was a really crappy analogy, but it's going to stick in your head. So on a go
I'm still
forward,
working my way through it.
yeah. My point being, one of them is still these artificial structures where we send out notifications here and there when there's a peak issue. It doesn't really create efficiency in the system. What you do when you stream correct pricing is you signal scarcity, right? Higher prices reflect more scarcity on the system. It's why bulk power prices go really, really high when it's cold or hot, because you're dispatching the more expensive assets that you rarely use, that are costly to operate. And if you didn't have to use those things, the price would come down. So if you have a situation where you're constantly streaming prices to devices that have if-then statements built into them, then you could still have these third-party aggregators, folks who would be involved in it, but you would basically program if-then statements into everything instead of saying, here's an event, here's not an event. They would simply respond to the market the same way we do when we see the price of eggs, bread, and everything else that I use for my French toast, including Canadian maple syrup. When the price of maple syrup's really high in Canada, I buy that sugar, nasty stuff, right? It's an elastic market response. That's where this all could eventually head. In a perfect world, you just stream prices to these devices and they would respond, and you would create efficiencies in the marketplace without having to create these artificial structures where, a capacity event is 6 hours long or 4 hours long, or here's a DR event or so on. No, you just stream prices to everything. And yes, if they didn't respond enough, you could tack on an additional, adder on that sort of thing, or have some mandated participation if you wanted to get an additional subscription. There's ways you could handle the non-responsive issue. But I think that's where you create true efficiencies. That's the point of designing competitive markets in the first place, was to design elastic responses.
Yeah, and we've seen some really cool results from ComEd's real-time pricing price signal too, in terms of how responsive customers have been to that model, which sort of replicates that. And also, as an aside, later on, we're going to have to talk about the United States strategic reserve of maple syrup, because I don't want you buying, I hail from Vermont, and I don't want you buying sugar or Canadian maple syrup. So to Rich Phillip, I think we've addressed some of the questions in the chat. So I'm going to go, here's a new one. And Rich, tell me if I'm wrong if we haven't gotten to them. So here's the first one. What companies are most active in adding if-then statements to devices capable of moving their loads, and who will keep the hackers at bay from overloading the grid with untimely loads? So we did talk a little bit about ComEd's real-time pricing program, but Peter, do you have anything else to add related to companies using if-then statements?
Yeah, I'm going to be curious to see, like, now that PG&E is doing it, who responds, or like the CalFlex program is kind of interesting because they're starting to figure out where this all goes. So there's no entity yet that's saying, oh, we're in the middle of this thing and we're wiring up all these thermostats to respond to prices. We're not there yet, but I think we will be. First we have to do some of the demonstrable capability of, okay, we can enroll these things in large quantities. We can get customers sort of out of the picture so they don't have to think about it and create efficiencies there. Then I think the prices to devices is the next step.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, another one that I wanted to ask about was the trends you're seeing in.
Thing. You
Yeah.
mentioned cyber. Cyber is absolutely critical, and we have to be very thoughtful about that. And one of the first places to start is the inverters, because they're often the thing that sits between the grid and the device. So sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, totally fine. And I think we have a couple more coming in right on this topic. So devices provide and promote and shift clean energy. You would want them every day, not only when there is scarcity. How would you operate them when prices are low with dynamic pricing?
Okay, so if it's a water heater, you'd certainly want to charge that thing when it's low. With batteries and EVs, that's where you get the juice, though, like the big absorptive capability. And so you'd want all your batteries in your EVs if possible, and certainly the ones sitting in people's garages or whatever, in a place where there's a lot of solar energy, you'd want to tummy tuck the duck, my trademark phrase, can't touch it, every single day and absorb all that solar energy, which would allow us to integrate more solar into the grid, for example. And then in the evening, you'd lop the duck's head off, which is not a beautiful phrase, and I won't trademark it, but that's what you'd want to do. In a place like California, if you looked at the CAISO annual report or the quarterly reports, you'll see that the net demand, net of solar, can go from, say, 20,000 megawatts in the morning or 8 o'clock in the evening down to close to zero. And then the ramp is from, say, 1 or 2,000 megs to like 22,000 megawatts in a short period of time. And batteries and other devices that could be programmed to absorb in the middle of the day and release in the evening could flatten that curve tremendously. We're just not enlisting them all yet at scale.
Right. And I think this is a really good point. Like, we need to move away from thinking about just the peak or those 10 hours of the year. It's going to be every day, because there could be valley filling. There could be local requirements because there's peaks at different distribution system levels as opposed to bulk system levels. There could be high weather events that occur. So there could be lots of different aspects to where you really want to optimize 24/7, and AI could actually really support that with the visibility in terms of value and need on the system. I think there was another question here related to this that I wanted to follow up on from Brenda. How do we ensure prices to devices creates opportunities for those who can't purchase the technology or are not able to shift their energy usage, or at a minimum avoid disadvantaging certain customers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but for example, there are many cases. One of the things, for example, you got everybody who has a water heater at some point, the water heater has an end of life. And if you're going to stay with a water heater with a tank, I mean, there's other technologies to look at now, which can be super efficient as well. There's heat pumps that can heat water on demand and so on. But one of the things to do is, especially for low income, is when something comes to end of life, ensure that the replacements are DR capable. So there's a way to either reduce costs or create a revenue stream for that customer that didn't exist before. And of course, when you have things like water heaters, they now have much more addressable capability than they did a few years ago. But one of the things we want to make sure is all of our devices have some kind of hacker-proof addressability, so that you don't have to add some kind of intermediate device to make them grid capable. They're simply manufactured that way.
Yeah, and you can see that in California's tech pilot, where they're putting 5 million heat pumps in California. They've moved to, the only eligible devices have those comms, and now there's a requirement to enroll in demand response programs if you receive the incentive. So this is like silo busting at a macro level.
There you go. There you go.
All sorts of different entities. It's electrification, energy efficiency, demand response, data access, etc.
But it's systems of systems thinking again, though.
Totally,
right?
Yeah. So not only will we need folks who can really think about data analytics, but also thinking about systems and systems be able to accomplish or innovate around these challenges. Ross was asking, with all of these DER devices that we can value stack, generating billions of transactions, what are your thoughts on the evolution of a new system of record, which is not necessarily the utility?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And there's a whole lot of different ways to approach this. I mean, there's actually some entities that are putting in DR devices on behalf of utilities. Minnesota, for example, has a distributed capacity program. So there's different ways of doing this. I think you, Ross, it makes sense to have a third party eh, that could be um, bigger than that. Like if each utility does it, you're gonna create that Tower of Babel and make it more difficult to universalize. And I'll give you an example. At Constellation, when I was running the DR group, we couldn't get efficiencies across multiple ISOs because the terminology was all different. And so you'd have to develop specific code for this market versus that one versus that one. As long as all this information is embedded within utilities and not has some universalizable nomenclature that would allow it to be standardized and universalized, you're going to create inefficiencies. So if you could get a third party that everyone would agree upon, that'd be great. I just think politically it's difficult, but it would be way more efficient.
Um, okay, I have one final question. I know Rich has popped up, but I wanted to end on this note. What are some of the headwinds that might be encountered in 2025, Peter?
Certainly, I think with the new administration, we're going to see fewer resources available for example, for utilities to move forward with pilots and test things out. We may see the decline over time of investment and production tax credits. I think probably we'll see more tariffs on imports of batteries and solar, et cetera, which will make things perhaps more costly than otherwise would be the case. So the economic environment could be a bit challenging. And yet at the same time, I think there are many states and there's so much value to be harnessed here and avoided costs to be addressed that even though there are some headwinds, I think the overwhelming and predominant economic logic continues to push this thing forward.
So tailwinds as opposed to headwinds.
Yeah, and the avoided costs, I mean, costs are going up. For DERs, that's a good thing. It may not be good for people, but if you're in that market, hey, the higher the avoided costs, the more incentive there is for people to get engaged with these technologies and sign up for these programs or interact with aggregators and utilities.
All right, Rich, I cede to you. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
And thank you to Peter Kelly-Detwiler and Olivia Patterson for an excellent discussion today. And clearly, guys, what a year it's going to be. To everyone joining us today, if you'd like to rewatch this discussion or share it with a colleague, we have two ways for you to do that. I'm going to get you to one. First of all, you can pick up the recording of this wherever you get your podcasts. Look for PLMA Load Management Dialogues. In addition, if you'd like to review the video and the earlier slides, you can do that by going to PLMA's YouTube channel. Couple quick reminders for you. Right now, we are in the open window time for nominations for PLMA's Awards of Excellence nominations. That's going to be open through February 4th. So if you have something that you think is excellent in the area of flexible load management, that this is your opportunity. You can go to peakload.org/awards to go through the process of nominating a project or situation that you think is excellent. In addition to that, we're holding classes. Our wholesale markets and our program design and implementation courses are being held in Indianapolis at Wabash Valley Power Alliance's headquarters, north side of Indianapolis, the week of February 17th. You can find out more information about that again at peakload.org/calendar. And then for those of you who might be attending Distributech this year, two things for you to be aware of. One is we're hosting our first ever symposium on DER grid services on March 24th. That's the Monday of Distributech week. They're on site at Distributech in the convention center there in Dallas. And you can find out more about that at our website. And then in addition, on the next day, March 25th, we're having our normal member meetup that we have for breakfast on the morning of the 25th. That's before all the keynotes and stuff that morning at 7 o'clock. And again, you'll be able to sign up for that at the PLMA calendar. So having covered all that in a whirlwind fashion, I want you to be aware that you've been listening to a load management dialogue presented by PLMA. To learn about upcoming dialogues and for an archive of past recordings, visit peakload.org or your favorite podcast platform. This concludes this edition. Thank you again, Peter and Olivia, and thank you all for joining today. We'll see you all soon, and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you.